Welcome to the Deep Dive, the show where we take a stack of information and extract the most important nuggets of knowledge or insight, giving you a real shortcut to being truly well-informed. In a world absolutely overflowing with data, the core challenge is often, how do you quickly get to the most important insights and, crucially, understand why things happen, not just what correlates? Today, we're diving headfirst into the fascinating world of causal inference. Specifically, we're looking at how we use data to understand genuine cause and effect. It's not just about, what variables to throw into our analysis. It's about understanding which ones can completely mess up our understanding of a situation.
That's right. Our mission today is all about Directed Acyclic Graphs, or DAGs. These are, incredibly powerful visual tools. They let us take what we already know about a subject, our real-world understanding, and turn it into a clear, actionable strategy for figuring out true cause and effect relationships. We're going to explore what makes a good control variable and, vitally, what makes a bad one.
Exactly, because, as the expert Jeffrey Wooldridge wisely put it, it's really tempting to just include anything in your model that helps predict the outcome, Just toss it all in. But we are going to unpack precisely why that, seemingly harmless approach can be a huge mistake. Understanding the difference between good versus bad controls is absolutely key to uncovering real causal effects, not just, misleading correlations. So let's unpack this a bit. When we talk about causal inference, what are we actually trying to achieve? At its heart, it's about identifying the average causal effect of a treatment, which could be anything really, a new policy, a medical intervention, an action, even a characteristic on a specific outcome.
And that's where DAGs become, indispensable. They provide this intuitive visual way to map out our existing knowledge about how different variables relate to each other. This map then helps us design a rigorous strategy to identify those true causal effects. The fundamental goal is to isolate the causal association from all those other non-causal factors that might be lurking around. We're trying to untangle the real drivers from all the noise. To do this, we work with what are called adjustment sets. These are basically the groups of variables we consider controlling for in our analysis. The real art, in science I suppose, lies in finding valid adjustment sets, ones that meet very specific criteria.
Right. And for you, the listener, a valid adjustment set, let's call it S, basically means that if we condition our analysis on this set S, the potential outcome we care about is actually independent of the treatment. Essentially, it means we've managed to account for all the non-causal reasons why the treatment and the outcome might look related. It's sort of like clearing away all the smoke, so you can see the actual fire.
Exactly. Now, when it comes to finding these valid adjustment sets, there are two main conceptual approaches we can think about. The first is what's called the counterfactual DAG approach. Sounds a bit complex, but imagine you're drawing a modified version of your DAG. In this version, you conceptually fix the treatment variable, let's call it D, to a specific value, say D. If your outcome of interest, Y, is then disconnected, or D-separated as they say, from D by your chosen set of controls, S, then S is a valid adjustment set. Think of it like severing all the non-causal wires between D and Y by putting S in the middle.
Okay, severing the wires, I like that. What's the other approach?
The second, and maybe more intuitive one for many people, operates on the actual factual D and is known as the backdoor path approach. Imagine your main causal pathway from the treatment D to the outcome Y is like a direct road, the front door, if you will. But there might also be these backdoor paths, alternative routes, through other variables that could make D and Y look related, even if D isn't directly causing Y that way. A set S is considered valid here if two key conditions are met. First, none of the variables in S are themselves caused by your treatment variable D. They can't be consequences of D. And second, and this is crucial, all those sneaky backdoor paths running from the outcome Y back to the treatment D must be blocked by S.
Blocked by S. So S acts like a roadblock on those alternative routes.
Precisely. This is how we ensure we've removed all those non-causal associations, allowing the true causal signal, the front door path, to emerge clearly.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, I think. While those theoretical frameworks are essential, you mentioned there are also practical strategies for finding these adjustment sets. And some are simpler, right? Some even work when you only have partial knowledge of the full DAG structure, which, let's be honest, is often the case in the real world.
Absolutely. Real-world knowledge is often incomplete. So let's look at some specific adjustment strategies. One common method is conditioning on parents. In a DAG, the parents of a variable are its direct causes. So imagine you have variables, let's call them x1 and x2, that directly influence your treatment D. If you control for just X1 and X2, you're often doing a good job blocking relevant backdoor paths involving them. It's often sufficient. Alternatively, look at the parents of the outcome Y. Let's say X2 and X3 directly influence Y. If, and this is important, they are not caused by your treatment D, then controlling for them can also be sufficient. But the key thing here is to avoid controlling for anything that is itself a consequence of your treatment. That's a major pitfall.
Right. Don't control for things downstream of the treatment.
Exactly. And this conditioning on parent strategy is incredibly useful because it often only requires you to know the immediate causes in a DAG, not the entire complex graph structure. It's also foundational for many propensity score strategies that are widely used in applied research. Now, while conditioning on parents of the outcome can sometimes improve statistical precision, make your estimate less noisy adjusting for both sets of parents, those of D and those of Y that aren't descendants of D can often provide a more robust analysis overall.
Okay, so parents are one strategy. What else?
Another approach is conditioning on all common causes of D and Y. This means identifying any underlying variables that are ancestors of both your treatment D and your outcome Y. Think about it like this. If you're studying the effect of a new educational program, D on student performance, Y, a student's underlying aptitude or socioeconomic background, let's call it Z, might influence both their likelihood of being in the program and their test scores.
So Z is a common cause.
Right. Controlling for all such common causes helps isolate the specific effect of the program itself. What's interesting, and a point made in the material, is that sometimes just controlling for the very root common causes isn't enough. In Pearl's example diagram, just controlling for the ultimate sources Z1 and Z2 doesn't work. You might need to include variables like X2, which are common causes, but maybe not the root ones. It depends on the structure.
Huh. Okay, so you need to be careful about which common causes.
You do. And related to this, sometimes the set of variables that completely mediate the effects of these common causes onto Y and D also works as an adjustment set. Finally, there's a more comprehensive strategy. Conditioning on the union of causes of D and Y, but explicitly excluding descendants of D other than Y itself.
Whoa, that sounds like a mouthful. Union of causes, excluding descendants.
It does, but the idea is actually quite powerful. You basically identify everything that could possibly cause your treatment or your outcome, all their ancestors. Then, you carefully remove from that list anything that is itself caused by the treatment, with the only exception being the outcome Y itself. So, for instance, you'd control for all the background factors that influence who gets a treatment and all the background factors influencing the outcome. But you wouldn't control for, say, an immediate side effect of the treatment if that side effect isn't the main outcome you're studying. This approach is often recommended as the maximally robust strategy in practice, especially when you don't know the exact immediate parents, but you do have a good sense of the broader upstream factors. It casts a wide net, but a careful one.
Okay, let's really get into this core lesson then. What we're learning here is that just blindly including variables, even ones that happen before the treatment, the pre-treatment ones, can actually introduce bias. It doesn't always help. It's not just about what to include, but maybe more importantly, what to exclude, or at least be really careful about. Let's look at some specific scenarios to really bring this home.
That's a crucial point. As a kind of high-level rule of thumb, for pre-treatment variables, things happening before your treatment, you generally want to adjust only for those that are ancestors of the treatment or the outcome, or maybe both. For post-treatment variables, things happening after your treatment, the rule is even simpler, usually. You should almost always avoid controlling for them.
Almost always avoid post-treatment. Got it. Let's start with pre-treatment then.
Okay. Pre-treatment variables or their proxies. A classic example of a good control is just an observed common cause, like the student aptitude example we mentioned. If Z influences both D and Y, controlling for Z blocks that shared influence that backdoor path, letting you see the D to Y effect more clearly. And even if that common cause, let's call it U, is unobserved, sometimes an observed variable Z can act as a good proxy control. This works if Z completely captures the information flow from that unobserved U to either the treatment D or the outcome Y. For instance, think about multivitamins D and birth defects Y. Maybe unobserved genetic factors, U, influence both. If family medical history, Z, is the only reason a mother decides on multivitamins, meaning Z fully captures U's influence on D, then controlling for Z, the medical history, can effectively block the confounding from the unobserved genetics. We call that a complete treatment proxy.
Okay, so proxies can be good if they capture the hidden factor's influence completely.
Yes. Another good control scenario involves what are called confounded mediators. This is a bit more subtle. Imagine a pre-treatment variable Z, It affects your treatment D, okay? But it also influences some intermediate step. Let's call it M, which lies on the causal path from D to Y. So D causes M causes Y. Controlling for Z here is good because it blocks a sneaky backdoor path. DEZ is like a common cause affecting both the start of the main path, D, and a step along the way.
Yeah.
Blocking Z closes that path.
Right, preventing that indirect influence from messing things up. What about neutral controls?
Good question. Neutral controls are variables that might affect the precision of your estimate, but they don't usually introduce bias themselves. So if a variable Z only affects your outcome Y, but not your treatment D, including it can actually be helpful. It can reduce the variance, the sort of random noise in your estimate, making it more precise, sharper focus.
Okay, so outcome-only causes can help precision.
But if Z affects only your treatment D and has no path to Y, except potentially through D, then including it doesn't introduce bias, but it can decrease precision. It essentially explains away some of the useful variation in your treatment variable D, leaving less signal for you to identify the causal effect on Y. It's like adding static.
Interesting. So sometimes including a variable makes things worse, even if it doesn't bias the result. Now for the bad ones.
Yes, bad controls. These are the ones that actively introduce or even amplify bias. A key one is bias amplification. This can happen when you mistakenly control for a variable that acts like an instrumental variable. Remember, an instrument, Z, is something that affects treatment D, but only affects outcome Y through D. Now, suppose there is some unobserved confounding between D and Y already making things difficult. If you then control for this instrument Z, you can perversely make the bias worse.
How does that work? Why worse?
Because you're essentially filtering out the clean variation in D, the part driven by the instrument Z, leaving behind only the variation in D that's tangled up with the unobserved confounder. You amplify the mess. That's why instruments have their own special methods. You don't just throw them in as controls in a standard regression.
Okay, avoid controlling for instruments. What else is bad?
Well, perhaps the most debated and counterintuitive bad control scenario involves M bias. This one really bends your brain sometimes. Imagine you have a pretreatment variable, Z, but Z isn't a common cause in the usual sense. Instead, Z is a common outcome of two independent, unobserved factors. Let's call them U1 and U2. And U1 affects your treatment D, while U2 affects your outcome Y. The diagram looks like a letter M on its side. DU1Z. UU2, UYZ is a collider for U1 and U2.
A collider, because two paths collide into it.
Exactly. Now here's the kicker. U1 and U2 are initially independent. But if you condition on their common outcome, Z, if you control for Z, you actually create a spurious correlation between U1 and U2 and the group you're looking at. It's called collider bias. And in this specific peculiar M structure, not adjusting for Z would actually give you the correct causal effect of D on Y, assuming no other confounding. Controlling for Z introduces bias where there was none of that type before.
Wow. So controlling for something seemingly related can actually create a problem. Can you give an example?
Yeah, a classic example discussed is homophily bias when trying to estimate peer effects, like how civic engagement spreads among friends. Let D be my engagement and Y be my friend's engagement. We want to see if D causes Y. If we only studied pairs of people who are already friends, we are implicitly conditioning on friendship. See, but maybe friendship happens partly because people with similar underlying civic tendencies, U1 for me, U2 for my friend, tend to become friends. Let's assume these tendencies, U1 and U2, are initially independent factors that also directly influence our actual engagement levels, D and Y. By only looking at friends, conditioning on Z, we might create a spurious link between my underlying tendency U1 and my friend's U2. This can make it look like my engagement D is causing my friend's Y, even if it's just reflecting the selection into friendship based on shared traits. It's a very subtle trap.
That is subtle. Friendship as a collider.
Now, I should add a nuance here. The M bias argument is quite sensitive. If those unobserved factors, U1 and U2, aren't actually independent to begin with, or if Z itself has a direct effect on D or Y, then the whole picture changes. There's actually an ongoing debate among experts about how common or how practically important M bias is in real-world data compared to standard confounding bias. So it's something to be aware of, definitely, but maybe not the first thing to worry about in every analysis.
Okay, that's a lot on pretreatment variables. Now let's move to the second big category you mentioned, post-treatment variables. You said the general rule is avoid controlling for them.
Yes, generally avoid. Why? Because it can happen implicitly without you even realizing it and cause major problems, like the example of studying education's effect on wages, but only looking at people who are employed. Employment status is often an outcome of education. It happens after the treatment of education. By selecting only employed people, you're implicitly conditioning on this post-treatment variable. This can lead to selection bias, meaning your findings for the employed group might not reflect the true effect of education for everyone. You're looking at a potentially biased slice of the population.
Right, the selection itself introduces bias. So what are the main ways controlling for post-treatment variables goes wrong?
Let's dive into some specific bad controls among post-treatment variables. The first, and perhaps most common, is mediation or over-control bias. This happens if a post-treatment variable Z lies directly on the causal pathway from your treatment D to your outcome Y. So D causes Z and then Z causes Y, D, Z, E, D, Y. If you control for Z, you are essentially blocking that causal pathway. You stop the effect of D from flowing through Z to Y in your analysis. As a result, you're no longer measuring the total effect of D on Y. You're only estimating a partial effect, sometimes called a controlled direct effect, the effect of D on Y that doesn't go through Z.
Okay, so you're only seeing part of the picture, like measuring river flow after a dam, as you said.
Exactly. Now, maybe that controlled direct effect is what you're interested in for your specific research question, and that's fine.
Yeah.
But you need to be clear that you're not estimating the total causal effect anymore.
Yeah.
And importantly, even conditioning on something that is descendant of the mediator Z can partially block that causal influence. It can still lead to underestimating the total effect.
Okay, over-control is one issue. What else?
Well, even if you are specifically interested in that controlled direct effect, you have to be careful about confounded mediator bias. This is another tricky one. Imagine your mediator, Z, D, AZ, he, Y, is itself confounded by some unobserved factor, U. So maybe U affects both Z and Y. DZ, U, Y. If you control for Z in this situation to get the direct effect of D on Y, you actually open up this collider path, Z, E, U, Y. This can introduce severe bias into your estimate of the direct effect, potentially making it look like there's a direct effect when there isn't one, or distorting its size.
Wow, so controlling for the mediator can open another can of worms if the mediator itself is confounded.
Precisely. It's like trying to untangle one knot and accidentally tightening another one. Then there's the broader category of Heckman selection bias, or collider bias involving post-treatment variables. Conditioning on any post-treatment variable that acts as a collider can introduce spurious correlations and open up non-causal paths between D and Y.
Like the Hollywood example you mentioned.
It's exactly like the Hollywood example. Fame is a post-treatment collider, an outcome of both talent and luck. Conditioning on fame by only looking at famous actors creates a spurious negative correlation between talent and luck in that selected group. Another famous example is the low birth weight paradox. Sometimes studies found that babies of mothers who smoked during pregnancy had lower infant mortality rates if they were low birth weight compared to low birth weight babies of non-smoking mothers.
That sounds completely backward.
It does. But low birth weight itself is an outcome, potentially influenced by smoking and other factors like underlying health issues that also affect mortality. Conditioning on low birth weight, which acts like a collider, might distort the relationship between smoking and mortality within that specific vulnerable group. And then there's the fantastic real-world anecdote of the industrial growth puzzle from the 19th century. Remember, the study found that despite presumably better nutrition D, average height Y, seemed to decrease in the US and UK. Totally counterintuitive. One very plausible explanation using this collider logic is that the study subjects were mainly Army or prison enlistees, Z.
Ah, so Z is enlistment status.
Right. And enlistment status, Z, is determined after your final height, Y, is realized. It's a post-treatment variable. It's also likely an outcome of height and other factors, like socioeconomic status or civilian job opportunities. Let's call them U. Maybe taller men, higher Y, had better job options, U influencing Z, and thus were less likely to end up as enlistees, Z. By conditioning on Z, only studying enlistees, the researchers might have inadvertently created a spurious negative association between the factors leading to better nutrition height, D, and height Y within that selected group. They were controlling for an outcome of the outcome, essentially.
That makes so much sense when you draw it out. Conditioning on who ended up in the sample biased the result.
Exactly. It's a classic example of collider bias from post-treatment selection. Now, there are a few sort of neutral controls among post-treatment variables, some theoretical edge cases where conditioning on a post-treatment Z might not introduce selection bias because it doesn't happen to be a collider on a relevant DY path. However, it's generally unclear if adjusting for such variables actually improves the analysis in any meaningful way, and they could still potentially hurt statistical precision. So the overwhelming advice remains. As a general rule, it's safest to avoid conditioning on post-treatment variables unless you have a very specific, well-justified theoretical reason, like aiming for a controlled direct effect with careful consideration of potential mediator confounding.
Okay, that's a really clear warning about post-treatment variables. So mostly we've talked about controlling for things or not controlling for things. Is that the only way to handle these causal questions?
Not entirely. Adjustment, or controlling for variables using those backdoor criteria, is the most common approach. But it's not the only strategy for identifying causal effects, especially when backdoor adjustment isn't feasible due to unobserved confounders. There's another really clever alternative strategy called the front door criterion. This is particularly useful in situations where you suspect there's unobserved confounding between your treatment D and your outcome Y, meaning you can't just control for everything using the backdoor path method, but you believe the entire effect of D on Y is fully mediated through some observed intermediate variable. It's called M.
Okay, so D causes M and M causes Y, and you can see M, but there's some hidden stuff messing up the direct D to Y link.
Exactly. You think DMY is the main path, but there's some unobserved U causing both D and Y, DAUY, so you can't just adjust for U.
So if I understand this simply, the front door approach is like breaking the problem into two manageable steps. You figure out the effect of the treatment D on the mediator M first, and then the effect of the mediator M on the outcome Y, and somehow combine them. It's like going through the front door M instead of worrying about the back door's U.
That's a great way to put it. Precisely. The criterion allows you to identify the total average causal effect of D on Y, even with that unobserved confounder U hanging around, as long as some key conditions hold. Those conditions basically ensure that. 1. All the causal influence from D to Y really does pass through your observed mediator M2. There aren't any unblocked backdoor paths from D directly to M and 3. There aren't any unblocked backdoor paths from M to Y other than the main DMY path. If those hold, it's a very elegant way to solve a seemingly intractable problem.
How does it work, sort of, under the hood, without getting too technical?
Conceptually, you use the observed data to identify two pieces separately. First, you identify how intervening on D changes M. Since there's no backdoor from D to M assumed, you can often estimate this relationship directly. Second, you identify how intervening on M changes Y. This is trickier because of the dy confounder U, but the front door setup uses D itself to help block the backdoor path from M back to Y, MDUY. So you can estimate the M to Y effect by effectively controlling for D. Once you have estimates for the DM effect and the MY effect, controlling for D, you can combine them, often just by multiplying them under certain assumptions like linearity, to get the overall dy effect. For instance, in a simple linear world, you might run two regressions, one of M on D and one of Y on M and D. The product of the coefficient on D in the first regression and the coefficient on M in the second regression gives you the average causal effect of D on Y. It's a really powerful demonstration of how causal structure helps us overcome missing information.
That's really cool. A completely different way of thinking about identification. Okay, so wrapping this all up, what does this mean for you, the listener, trying to make sense of all the information out there and figure out what's actually causing what? It seems to mean being incredibly thoughtful, maybe even skeptical, about the variables included or excluded in any analysis claiming causality. Recognizing that just using your intuition or even following what seems like standard practice can sometimes lead you completely astray. Just throwing every pre-treatment variable into a model might feel safe or thorough, but as we've explored in detail, it's absolutely not. It could be actively harmful.
Absolutely. And this deep dive, I hope, really highlights why tools like DAGs are truly indispensable for making these kinds of nuanced decisions. They force you to be explicit about your assumptions. It's fundamentally not about just maximizing prediction or throwing every variable you have into a statistical model. It's about strategically, carefully selecting controls, or sometimes using alternative methods like the front door criterion to genuinely isolate and uncover true causal effects. DAGs help you visualize the potential traps before you fall into them.
So here's something maybe for you to mull over next time you read a study or hear a claim about cause and effect. When someone presents an analysis claiming a causal link, really ask yourself, have they truly accounted for all the plausible non-causal reasons for that association? Have they blocked the right backdoors? And perhaps even more subtly, as we learned today, could they be implicitly controlling for something, maybe through how they selected their sample or defined their variables? That might actually be introducing bias rather than removing it, like controlling for a collider or a post-treatment variable.
Yeah, that's the key takeaway. This exploration really underscores that sometimes doing nothing not controlling for a problematic variable like an M-bias collider is actually better than doing the wrong thing. Understanding this crucial difference between good and bad controls is, I think, a real shortcut to becoming truly well-informed. It empowers you to ask the right critical questions about the evidence you encounter every day. It's about pushing beyond simple correlation and really digging into the mechanics of cause and effect.